I wasn't humiliated, I wasn't beaten. Worse, I was forgotten. The billionaire, the philanthropist, the man who, according to Forbes, had just reinvented the future of medicine, was simply forgotten, like an old, useless thing, at my own gala. Standing by the window overlooking the neon canyon of Manhattan, in a $10,000 tuxedo, feeling the weight of success as concrete, I overheard my 14-year-old son, Elliot, telling his friend that his father was the software engineer who invented the delivery app, not me, Jonathan Kane, who had created Pharmanova and held his entire future in his shares. It was a blow not to the heart but to the place where a billionaire stores his value, in his reputation, in his myth of self-importance. It was that invisible American insult that says, "You're no longer needed." I felt the cold, steely feeling of emptiness that I had spent years filling with deals, power, and speed finally burst through the wall and filled me completely, and at that very moment, as I tried to swallow that taste of invisibility, a message arrived on my secure phone, an encrypted file, a single line of text. "You didn't buy this company, Jonathan. You stole it." A wave of icy horror washed over me, because I immediately recognized this email, this style, this old, rusty lie that I had buried under my first million 20 years ago, and I remembered a face, not my own, but the face of the girl I was with at the time, the co-founder I had pushed out because she believed in ideals, and I believed that the American dream was all about numbers. Success here in New York is measured by the ability to ignore the past, but this bell, this cry from the grave of my conscience, was too loud to ignore. I realized that all my fortune, my name, even this grand emptiness, all had been built on a false foundation, and now the foundation was beginning to crack. I hurriedly left my own gala, grabbed my car keys, and as the elevator doors closed behind me, I heard my son's last words, uttered with utter indifference. "Dad, are you leaving yet?" In that moment, I finally understood. I had lost much more than just my legacy. I had lost my true self in the pursuit of his shiny copy. I tried to act rationally, like a true American businessman who had been trained to turn crises into opportunities. But this time the crisis was too personal and too deeply rooted in my own history. I tasked my security chief, the man who had been running my illegal protection for years, with finding the source of the email, but within a day he, ever so steadfast and loyal, informed me of his retirement, and his words, spoken with cold, professional indifference, were worse than betrayal. "Jonathan, this is not war. This is a rotten swamp, and I don't want to drown in it. You know I can't hide it, and neither of us can. It's coming back." His refusal to protect me was the first crack in my armored world, but the real hell began a week later, when an investigative article in the Wall Street Journal was published, devoted to the dark history of Pharmanova's founder, which subtly but deadly accurately hinted at the falsification of clinical trial data in the company's early years, the unexpected deaths of patients who mysteriously disappeared from official records, and, of course, the mysterious fate of my former partner, Sarah. The media tore me to pieces, exploiting the American thirst for exposing idols. The former partners at Pharmanova, the same Wall Street sharks who had fed on my dividends for years, began to publicly distance themselves, demanding my resignation from the board of directors, citing moral responsibility, the same hypocritical morality that we had all collectively hidden under billion-dollar deals. My lawyer, an old friend who knew more about my skeletons than I did, advised me to publicly admit to technical errors and, nobly, take a year off, but I knew that would mean total annihilation. It wasn't just the company I had spent 2 decades building that was being lost. It was my narrative. The myth of Jonathan Kane as a self-made man, a pure genius who could create something out of nothing, the very myth that underpins the American mentality. I desperately tried to find Sarah, the woman who was now behind it all, but she seemed to have been swallowed by the earth, And then I realized that this wasn't just blackmail or a stock fight. It was revenge, subtle and sophisticated, planned for years, and she was using my own sins as a weapon. When my wife, Martha, came to my office, not to support me, but to discuss the terms of our divorce and the division of our property, her eyes were as cold as the northern ice, and she said only one thing. "You always said you couldn't have it all, Jonathan. But you tried. You took a woman's future for my present. I don't want it anymore." Her words were the final break, a moment of profound, irreversible loss that was far worse than the stock market crash. I had lost the war without even seeing my enemy, and now I stood before the abyss, utterly devastated and alone. When I was at my lowest ebb, holed up in my glass and steel prison penthouse, surrounded by search warrants and calls from angry shareholders, my unexpected salvation came not from a brilliant lawyer or a wise mentor, but from a cleaning lady named Esther, an old, inconspicuous woman who had worked at Farmanova since day one, quietly cleaning up the mess that we big business people had made. She came into my office one night as I watched my world crumble, and without looking up, she handed me an old, worn-out notebook, its cover worn to the point of holes. "Mr. Kane," her voice was low and calm, like the soft murmur of a river, "do you think you're the only one who's seen us grow up? I remember how Miss Sarah spent nights here when you were just dreamers, not monsters. She didn't want money, she wanted the truth. And she left it to you because she knew that sooner or later you would get tangled up in your own success." I grabbed the notebook. It was Sarah's diary, but not a personal one. It was a journal of her scientific observations, dating back to the first months of the company's existence, a time when we were still idealists and believed in changing the world. Among the dense, neat notes and diagrams, I found a page dedicated to the first patient to die during clinical trials, the very person whose death had been, technically, concealed from my filing. Sarah hadn't just recorded his death, she had pinpointed the exact cause, not a side effect of the drug, but a special additive introduced by a competing company that sought to discredit our new technology. She didn't expose it publicly at the time because, as her calligraphic handwriting had written, "If I expose them, I will destroy our shared dream. They will win. I have to find another way, an honest way, to expose them without destroying the good we have done." It was a bolt from the blue. There was a conspiracy, but it was twofold. I had betrayed Sarah, driven her out, and covered up the patient's death for financial gain, but the real, global enemy was much larger than I could have imagined. It was the entire pharmaceutical empire behind the competitor. I realized that Sarah didn't want me to be completely destroyed. She sought to make me see the real dirt in this galaxy I thought was mine, and to use that knowledge, that forbidden truth, to clear my name and, more importantly, the name, Farmanova, of the lies. This was not just proof. It was her forgiveness and a challenge, thrown after years of silence, demanding that I finally become the person I was meant to be. Armed with Sarah's diary, which contained irrefutable evidence of sabotage by Omnicorp, the giant that had held the pharmaceutical market in an iron fist for years, I was faced with a choice that would define who I really was, not as a billionaire, but as a person. My lawyers, upon learning of this, immediately suggested the rational, American way: use these documents to fend off the media, clear Farmanova's name, and regain control of the company, then quietly destroy Omnicorp in a legal war. "Jonathan, this is your chance," my chief counsel said. "You can come out of this clean and even richer. This is the American way. Use their weapons against them." But I looked into their predatory, glittering eyes and felt disgusted. That path would only require me to continue playing the old game, in which truth is just a tool and honesty is a weakness, and I could no longer do that. The real dilemma was not how to defeat Omnicorp, but how to atone for that first sin, my banishment of Sarah, and my concealment of the truth about the patient's death. I knew that in order to show the world the whole picture, I had to expose my own filth first. I had to be the first to explode the myth of Jonathan Kane as a flawless hero. My hand shook as I dialed a number I hadn't used in 2 decades, Sarah's number, which, surprisingly, was active. Her voice was low, full of weariness and determination. "You thought I wanted money, Jonathan?" she asked. "No. I wanted you to face the one you betrayed, your ideal and me. Are you finally ready?" I made my decision. A public press conference. It was a suicide on Wall Street, but the only thing that could save me as a person. Instead of playing the game of big business war, I went to the podium, and in front of the cameras that had been tearing me apart yesterday, I did something no one, not even Omnicorp, expected. I confessed my sin. 20 years ago, I chose quick success over honesty. I betrayed my partner. I covered up the death of a patient, believing that my success would justify the price. It was a cry of repentance. And only then, when my stock had already collapsed and my reputation was in ruins, did I lay out the evidence against Omnicorp, evidence that left them no chance. I chose the complete destruction of my financial world, but I found the only way to save my moral compass, risking everything to finally become honest. The consequences of my confession were both catastrophic and liberating. I lost Farmanova. My name became synonymous with both a brilliant startup entrepreneur and a moral fraud, but that loss was far lighter than the burden of the secret I had carried for 2 decades. The investigation that began after my public act of sacrifice quickly escalated into a national scandal that ultimately brought down Omnicorp, exposing decades of fraud and antitrust collusion, and it was Sarah's fault, not mine. We met a month later, not in a courtroom or a fancy restaurant, but on a humble bench in Central Park, and it was the meeting of 2 people who had survived their own deaths. She made no apologies. Her eyes, now calmer than I remembered, simply looked right through me. "You did it, Jonathan," she said, looking at the children playing nearby. "You broke down the wall you were building. But that doesn't undo what you did to me. And it won't bring that patient back. You may be rich, but you can't be honest until you're willing to give up your wealth for the truth. And you did, even though it was too late." I agreed. I wasn't trying to redeem the past. I was trying to find a way to move on without being a slave to it. I transferred most of my remaining fortune to a foundation Sarah had set up, dedicated to supporting independent scientific research, free from corporate pressure. It wasn't redemption. It was paying back a debt to an ideal I had once buried. My son, Elliot, no longer able to flaunt my billionaire status, came to my house, not for the money, but with one question. "What do you mean, Dad?" I answered simply, without embellishment, for the first time in years. "I was a coward. I took the easy way out, son. The American dream is not about how much you have. It's about what you're willing to lose for what you believe in. I had to lose everything to find myself." Jonathan Kane's story as a successful tycoon was over. But another story had begun. I now worked as a consultant at Sarah's foundation, quietly, without fame, helping young scientists avoid repeating my mistakes. Is it possible to be rich and honest? Maybe, but only if you realize that true honesty will always have a price higher than any fortune. I didn't become a saint. I just became less rich and much more genuine. It was a message I could finally convey to my son, one that stood far above the stars of Wall Street.